Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. So this is our thinking on how we'd like to proceed. First of all, a reminder of the group agreements that have been agreed for the main committee and also pertain here insofar as they're relevant. Maintain awareness of power differentials, community members get priority, share time equally and proportionally, share your own experience, default to confidentiality, listen actively and fully, avoid generalizing and assumptions, remember that intent and impact matter, value dissenting opinions, maintain the goal of dialogue, not debate, be curious, practice accountability, limit the use of the chat box to procedural and informational items only. I've also added 2 elements of that which are specific to the subcommittees. Members are asked to limit themselves to 3 minutes each. And Kevin, if you wouldn't mind keeping time, I'd be very grateful.
Pleasure.
And I'd also request that we try and do the same round robin system that we have in the main meetings, where we queue people up by having them raise their hands, and then we go to people one after the other, just to maintain a smooth flow during the course of this meeting. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay. Now we're going to turn to what we hope to achieve today. The charge that was given by the full committee was for this subcommittee to identify which policy suggestions from Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing and the CRB testimony put forward by CRB member Lindsay Foltz it wants to discuss, as well as any other items that the committee deems relevant. To discuss those policies, agree a form of words or agree the wording for motions that will come to the full committee, and then vote on taking those motions forward. Does that seem like a set of goals that people recognize or are happy to proceed with? Okay, if I don't hear any opinions to the contrary, then I will proceed. So my suggestion is this, which is that you've received a range of different documents. You've received the grid that contains all of the 21st Century Policing and Campaign Zero policies. You've also received Lindsay Foltz's testimony, which includes some of the same material, but in some cases covers elements in more detail. And in particular, there are some things that pertain very particularly to Eugene, because Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing assume that there is no police auditor or similar function. So my proposed way of proceeding is this. We talk about the specific policies from the grid and from Lindsay's document, and also if you've had the chance to read it, Brian Michaels sent over a short piece of testimony as well. We then go through those in the order that they're raised. We decide on the precise wording that we'd like to take forward to the full committee, and we vote on doing so. If time allows, we would like to discuss policies that are outside of the jurisdiction of the city, such as items covered by state law, federal law, and collective bargaining agreements. So again, I hope that everyone is clear. So I just received a message from Brian saying that he's having issues getting in. Jeremy, would you be able to resend to him his invite? He's saying that he's having problems with the password. My apologies, just need to make sure that everyone's able to get into the meeting. And then in terms of next steps for going forward, the motions that are agreed by this subcommittee will be added to the packet going out to the full committee. And we plan to send that out this Friday. And the full committee will vote individually on including each recommendation in the final report. There is another option that this subcommittee might choose to say, which is that certain recommendations come as a package. That is, of course, entirely up to you to make that decision. If you feel that there are several policy elements that will not work unless they're all considered together. So if everybody is happy with that way of proceeding, the next order of business then would be to discuss the policies that we'd like to take forward. Oh, forgive me. Betsy Davis asked for a few minutes to give an informational update to committee members. So Betsy, if 5 minutes is sufficient for you.
Oh, I thought I was going to get 3, so I was trying to
Okay.
get my mind how to do it in 3. I'll try to do it
Well,
in 3.
should we compromise on 4 then?
How about that? There's so little compromise these days. Yes, that's fine.
Indeed.
What I just wanted to fill the committee in is 5-6 years ago when the police contact policy was being drafted. LULAC, I was on the head of the racial profiling subcommittee at LULAC, and we got a copy of the draft. And I was raised within an indigenous worldview, and so I was taught long ago, before the term structural and systemic racism came about, that policies are structured in such a way around constructs that have their public meaning, original meaning, because they have been sort of contextualized and substantiated through precedent in law, and particularly for police. And what we noticed about the police contact policy was the policy is structured around that singular important construct of reasonable. And the structure of the policy ensures that the white police officer, male police officer, will be the most reasonable one. And so I prepared a 5-page document leading people through the where the structural racism was, and how, like the Voting Rights Act, you can put a fence around it, because that's all you can do until we can go look at precedents set throughout the time, in 200 years in this country. You can't really do much about that, but you can put a fence around it. In the Voting Rights Act, they had that until public, meaning originalist judges, gutted it, and 5 minutes later, Southern states were disenfranchising black voters. The fence is a way to put a criteria of what is unreasonable. We can't change reasonable through the court precedent and statutes, but we can define what's unreasonable. So we had a system, and some of the things we suggested, I now find in Campaign Zero and the 21st Century Commission on Policing. The business card, we suggested that. Spent a year, Lily Parker and I, then Patricia Toledo and I, a year talking to the police chief. Mark Gissner, who's still the police auditor. We went to the police commission, and we were summarily dismissed. The police chief said every officer knows how to define reasonable. I challenged him on that and asked if I could do a qualitative study. Then he says, well, there are laws and statutes. I said, I don't know any law and statute that's specific. And plus, who served as jurors and judges through the primary history of those laws and statutes, white males and wealthy white male judges. So, what is reasonable? So when I suggested the business cards, he said, well, that's just too expensive. And then he sent me to Mark Gissner. And, we were dismissed really by the auditor, but I realized that the systemic part of systemic racism is that the police auditor has their policies, which are structured around constructs, which match with the police department. They are systemically linked. And so we found that in addition to the card system, we do have to set up independent entities to receive complaints from citizens. We do need to break that systemic link that exists. It's not Mark Gissner's fault. It's not the chief of police's fault. It's just the history of this nation, and it exists. And
just a time check, Betsy.
Okay.
Just a
4 minutes?
just a 30-second, just to let you know.
Okay, so we did those things and they were not heeded. So LULAC has a real concern that because these are recommendations, our recommendations are not going to be taken. And that's a real concern because we've been through this for a year and a half. So there you have it. We'd like to see those things recommended again, but would like some way to know that they've been followed through on and taken seriously. So that was my comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Betsy, and thank you for contacting us in advance to ask for a bit of time on the agenda. I think the next order of business then is to start identifying policies. And if you look at the agenda that was sent out, the way that I've suggested that we proceed, and it is very much a suggestion, the subcommittee can lead on this. is that we go through the grid that was sent out and identify the policies that members would most like to discuss, that we then discuss those, because the charge given to this committee by council was to ground itself in 21st century policing and Campaign Zero. Once we've been through that discussion, we go through the testimony that's been submitted by Lindsay and by Brian, take some of those ideas, and then if there are any other items that committee members are bringing, that we deal with those last, because they are they haven't been submitted in paper beforehand. If everybody's happy with that, then I'd ask you to raise your hands, and we can start the business of diving into policy.
Electronically or physically?
Electronically, if possible, simply because it lines people up in the order that they raised their hands, which makes it slightly easier for me.
I have to find it again.
Are you asking us to raise our hands to speak or to proceed to say?
To speak, if you have any policy elements that you would like to come to. I'm not seeing any hands from anyone. Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, so over the weekend, I've read through all of this and jotted down ones. And interestingly enough, one of the ones that seemed to me to be one of the simplest was that for all stops, police officers be required to give their name, badge number, the reason for the stop, and a card with this information and instructions for filing a complaint. So perhaps start with that one. That to me seemed like one of the simplest things that could be done.
Okay. Do you have any others? I think you have about a minute left.
Yeah. Well, I kind of grouped them in different areas, and
Sure.
this one was the one that was just kind of hanging off on its own because the others related more directly to either the police commission, the CRB, or the police auditor.
Okay. Does anyone else have any immediate suggestions from Campaign Zero or 21st Century Policing? Okay, just had a message from Brian saying that you're struggling to raise your hand. Does that mean that you wish to raise your hand, or simply that you haven't, that you would like to be in the line, or just that you're struggling? Yeah. Okay.
Would like to be in the line, yeah.
Well, you would be next in line then.
Okay.
Go ahead and speak, Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were still talking with Daniel. Was he finished? I guess.
I believe so, yeah.
I submitted some items here this morning related to the Civilian Review Board. Some of them were from Campaign Zero and some of them were not. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to review that. It has some history, and it talks a little bit about my experience with the police auditor. And I just sincerely believe that if we don't make changes that will institute discipline to people who have done awful things on behalf of the police, then we will not change the police behavior at all. That's it.
Okay. Would you like to cite some of the policies that you, some of the policy changes that you're suggesting?
Well, they're in what I wrote. I'll just read it off of there, sure. Regarding the Civilian Review Board, in order for it to be an effective investigative tool, it needs to be made up of citizens only. That means no police officers, with the majority coming from civic organizations, including human rights groups representing marginalized communities and communities of color, and a representative of the clergy community. That was all in campaign 0. The initial membership will be nominated by these groups, and all future seats will be filled by the CRB members only. So once we get a full civilian review board, then any changes in the membership of that board would be elected by the board. And that way we maintain a sense of a body that is truly independent when it investigates the police. Largely because of my experience with the current police auditor that I mentioned in what I wrote, it's obviously a failed position. And so he or she may collect all the complaints, but all of those complaints need to go to the Civilian Review Board. And then the Civilian Review Board gets to decide whether to investigate those complaints. And if they do decide to investigate those complaints, their decision whether to discipline an officer or not following their investigation will be final, except maybe to the city council. And in order to conduct a good investigation, they're going to need subpoena power for all police records and police officers. And that investigation will necessarily need to hear from complainants and their witnesses. Currently, the complainants are not heard from. Neither the Babb family, who was the family of the veteran who was shot dead in his home from a military
30-second time check, Brian, sorry.
In his home, they were not allowed to appear. Neither were my clients, the woman and child, son who were beaten up by the police. And the rest of it is in what I presented. The spoliation issue, which is if the cameras don't work, then the police don't get to testify about what would have been on the camera. And I cited a case from Oregon regarding 2 manslaughter charges that were dismissed because the state was not allowed.
Thank you, Brian.
To say they
Time's up.
were at fault, but that they were not allowed to say that the brakes were functioning properly. So you can see how seriously this is taken in a matter of law, because people who destroy their own evidence don't get to say what that evidence was, don't get to present that evidence. Thank you for letting me go on.
Okay, thank you very much. I now have Betsy in line.
I will do it real quick. Obviously on line 38 in the Excel file, carrying business cards containing their names, I think is very important. I think the one above it, which I believe was said by a fellow committee member, adopt policies requiring officers to identify themselves. But the stories that I have been told, that doesn't always happen. And I don't know how we can ensure that the officers identify themselves when they simply do an unsolicited contact. 2 Black men standing in a parking lot of a bank talking, police stop, and then indicate that they don't belong there. Those kinds of contacts, that's where I think the business card could be. But I don't know how we could get them to identify, because these 2 brothers that I knew asked the police officer's name and badge number, and they said, you don't need to know who I am, I need to know who you are and why you're here. So we have to be cautious about how that one goes. The other one I saw was mandated internal and external and independent criminal investigations. I think there should be external and independent investigations of all officer behaviors when there's a citizen complaint. It's surely use of force and egregious actions, yes, but also those day-to-day ones that happen. The auditor's office is, like I said, not as independent as we would like it to be. So those were the 3 sort of categories.
Okay, so I'm just going to recap the list that I have. Daniel, your main one that you raised was that all stops should involve the officer handing over a business card and explaining how a complaint can be undertaken. Brian, you had several which are also included in your testimony, but that the CRB should be citizens only, and should be made up of civic organizations, that the CRB should be empowered to elect future members, that the CRB should be able to hear from complainants, and that the police should not be able to testify on occasions where their cameras are not working. So I hope I haven't missed anything. Please do let me know if I have.
As Rick Rosetta has his hand raised.
Yeah, for some reason, I don't find the box at the bottom of the participants for me to click for raising my hand, but I will.
Okay. Thank you for informing me.
Sure, that's okay. I just didn't know what to do, so I raised my hand. Some of these issues that have been discussed seem to be related to issues unrelated to citizen oversight, really. I mean, handing someone a card saying who you are and opening up your dialogue with a citizen, if you're a cop, that says, here's where you complain if you don't like me, is kind of a bad way to approach a situation to me. The second thing I'd like to say is that while Brian is a good advocate and was advocating for his clients, I disagree with his opinion that there should be an active citizens review board that has the duty to investigate issues that are already being investigated by the police auditor and a staff that's already paid to do that. The citizen review board meets 10 to 13 times, 12 or 13 times a year already. They're volunteers. It's difficult for anybody to donate that much time to be able to be involved in reading files, looking at all the video, and it just is impractical. I think the Citizen Review Board performs its function in that it monitors what the auditor is doing and makes a decision about whether what the auditor has done is reasonable under the circumstances. Those are the comments I have at this time.
Okay, thank you, Rick. I think we've kind of moved on to discussion rather than the simple listing of the items that we'd like to move forward. So, and I can see that there's a great many hands up. I think the best way to proceed, given that we have this list of items, would be to discuss them as motions, if people agree with that. So taking Daniel's, for example, if we were to say that, you know, this subcommittee moves that that all police officers should carry business cards and hand them over at a stop whenever they stop someone, and inform that person how they can complain. Then we can have a discussion on the specifics of that item. Does that feel to this committee like a good way to proceed?
Sure.
Okay, I'm not hearing any dissent. So
are the topics decided on? Is that what you're saying?
the first tranche of topics are decided on. We can also continue to swing back around because there's quite a lot of material here. But if members of the committee are happy to do so, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 items, I believe, that can be discussed immediately. But again, as I said, I'm merely the facilitator. So if anyone in the committee feels differently, please let me know. So with that, Daniel, would you like to?
Well, there was one item that I didn't hear you mention, I'm sorry, which was subpoena power to the Civilian Review Board.
Right, subpoena power. Daniel, would you like to choose a form of words or choose the wording rather?
Yes.
And
I move that for all stops, police officers be required to give their name, badge number, the reason for the stop, and a card with this information on it, and the card will also have instructions for filing a complaint.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, Betsy second. And can I get I'll take a roll call vote. So Daniel and Betsy is 2 out of, I believe there are 5 of us here today, 5 committee members. So Brian, how do you vote?
I think I see 7 people here, committee members.
Just 5 committee members.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, there may be others. Yeah.
I thought all these people were, okay. Well, I happen to agree with Mr. Rosetta. It's just too clumsy of an idea. Not really within our purview.
Okay, so that's 2 in favor, 1 against. Rick?
Against. I would vote against it.
Okay, David?
For it.
Okay. So by 3 in favor, 2 against, the idea as contained in campaign 0, the police officers should hand over their cards and issue instructions for any complaint, carries. So that's the first of our motions. Okay, and Daniel, that was the only item you mentioned. Brian, you asked for the CRB to be a citizens-only body, and for future membership to be elected for the CRB. Sorry, forgive me, lost my place there for a moment. That the CRB should be a citizens-only body appointed from civic organizations, and the body itself should be entitled to elect future members. Would you like to move that as a motion?
Yes.
I second that.
Okay. So Brian moves, Daniel seconds. I'm just going to go along. Betsy, what are your feelings?
Yes.
Yay or nay?
Yay. Yes.
Rick?
They're already all citizens on the committee, and I think that's superfluous. So I vote nay.
Okay. I think that actually this is a good time to bring in, and forgive me, I should have done this upon agreeing to put the motion on the agenda. Cindy or Leah, are you able to clarify number 1, the makeup of the CRB, and number 2, whether there is a possibility for the appointment process to be as Brian has asked?
So this is Leah. I can answer to that. The Civilian Review Board is already made up of only civilians. There are no police officers allowed on the board per ordinance. The city ordinance also sets out the selection process for CRB members. It directs the mayor and auditor to create a subcommittee that then makes recommendations to council, and then council appoints members to the CRB. So to change that process would probably, in my mind, require a change in ordinance, but that is up to this committee. So that's how it's currently done. I hope that helps.
So with that clarifying information, Brian, would you still like to move the motion either as it has been originally stated or with any changes?
Well, I kind of knew there weren't any police on the board. That was more of a preventive sentence. But for the rest of it, correct me if I'm wrong, once again, but this is ultimately, we're going to ask the city council to change policy through city code. And so that would be what I'd be recommending, that the remainder of this motion be submitted to the Eugene City Council so that it can adjust the code to match this motion.
Okay, so you were asking then to move the motion that says that CRB members should be appointed that future CRB members are appointed by current CRB members rather than by the existing process.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Is there a second for that?
Just a point of information. Could you please repeat, Leah, that the CRBs are recommended by a panel and then appointed by the council? And who is on that panel?
Sure.
And so I guess one question perhaps as a possible amendment is, could there be a requirement for who is on that panel to ensure that there is sufficient representation from marginalized communities?
Sure, absolutely. So I can try to pull up this specific ordinance language, and I'm trying to do that for the makeup of the CRB right now, just so you guys all have that. I would say historically, the mayor and auditor have drawn from LULAC, previous CRB members, and NAACP representation. I'm just going on my memory right now. So that's, we try to get a diverse representation, but I will find that section in the code and put it in the chat right now.
And are the recommendations from that panel, are they binding, or is that a closed circle, or can the council then choose from outside that circle? And perhaps if we had a more mandatory that the makeup of the CRB must come from within that group of people that that panel puts forth, that might end up with the same end result of guaranteeing that there be sufficient representation from marginalized communities and those most impacted by police misconduct.
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head that those recommendations are not binding to council. The recommendations of that subcommittee go to council, and then council does have to choose from the pool of people who have applied to the CRB. There's we take part in the citywide boards and commissions application process at the beginning of each year. And then people designate if they are interested in CRB. Those people are looked at by that subcommittee, and then that pool, that entire pool, goes to council.
Is there anything that prevents family members of police officers or former police officers from serving?
Yes, so I was gonna just about to put that in the chat. No City of Eugene employee or family of City of Eugene employee, including police officers or city employees.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll pop that in the chat right now.
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Leah. So do we have a second for Brian's motion?
Brian, are you willing to amend it at all based on, amend your motion at all based on that?
Well, you know, I don't take these things personally, so in reality, if it all goes through the police auditor, it's less likely to be an effective body. That's just how I see it. And if people don't see it that way, and they think the police auditor is just a fine avenue for all this to go through, then the motion fails. I mean, that's just pretty much it. If you want to make a motion that it goes through the police auditor, and that's where the members come from, use that. Go ahead. I mean,
that's not what I heard, Brian. So maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
Didn't you say the police auditor picks the people to be on a committee to elect the Now, what's the role of the police auditor in the CRB?
I'm just going to read the code section out loud because I think that's going to be the best way for you guys to hear what happens. So it's 2.2421C in the city code. Appointments to the Civilian Review Board shall not be made on the basis of constituency or representation of any particular group. A candidate selection process that includes a community panel to review applications and recommend qualified candidates for council consideration shall be developed by the mayor in consultation with the auditor to help achieve a balanced membership. Sorry. And then there are certain requirements such as not being an employee or immediate family member of an employee. But just so you all know how that currently goes, that's in the chat over on the right.
And so it goes through the police auditor. I mean, that's kind of what you're saying. Police auditor, he or she would be involved with the mayor in selecting the members.
Well, it says to balance. What does balance mean? Balance what? What do the police auditor and the mayor, when they look at what the community has suggested, what balance are we talking about that they get to do? Do you know?
I'm assuming that was for me, Betsy. Yeah.
Well, anybody who knows. Yeah.
Well, I'll do my best. The actual determination of a balanced membership, is fairly within the hands of council, I think, and just in my reading of that. Let me try to pull it up again just so I can look at it. But I will say, in my experience, the auditor and the mayor try to get a wide. I mean, we've had, I think, up to 18 people on that subcommittee. We have a very broad group of people on that board, on that. I don't want to get too confusing with all my terms. And then council is the one who ultimately decides. And sometimes they do, sometimes they've taken the recommendations of the subcommittee and sometimes they haven't.
Okay, so bringing us back then, we don't seem to have a second to Brian's motion. So if there's no dissent, I would invite members to move on to the next policy proposal, which is that the CRB should be able to hear from complainants. And to my understanding, and Cindy or Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, the specific issue is that they can't hear in the meeting where the complaint is brought. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So that's in the CRB protocols that were bargained for with the union. There's one of the protocols is that people aren't meant to discuss or share personal experiences about the case that's being reviewed at the meeting where the case is being reviewed. They can at other meetings, but that is in those, the bargain for protocols.
Okay.
Sorry. I just want to be clear, I'm not advocating for anything. I'm just trying to let everybody know how
No, of course.
Okay.
I think everybody here is well aware that your role is informational. And I am particularly grateful for the level of knowledge that you bring to proceedings here. This is certainly not my area of policy expertise, so thank you very much for bringing some clarity to these proceedings. So
can I just add one thing to that? Kind of the reasoning behind that, I believe, was to try to protect the identities of the involved employees on the case that is being discussed that night, because CRB members, while they're reviewing the case, they're not supposed to identify, use officers' names or any additional information that might identify them. So that is, it goes in tandem with that.
Thank you, Cindy. So with that extra information, Brian, are you happy to move the motion that the CRB should be able to hear from complainants at the meeting in which the complaint is brought?
Yes, absolutely. And I might add that in Lindsay's testimony that was submitted, she advocated for that as well.
Yep.
I second that.
Okay, so Brian moves. Daniel seconds.
Kaz, can I jump in here just for a sec? So the person seconding doesn't indicate yay or nay. They're just seconding. So you do have to, when you do the roll call, you have to ask for their vote.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, what's your vote?
I don't really understand how the CRB could be expected to hear a case and render a reasonable judgment on it without being able to hear all sides of that case. And I understand the issues of employee anonymity, but in my thinking that these are public servants with whom we entrust a great deal of power, and the power to potentially destroy lives, and that power needs to come with a level of responsibility and accountability that part of which is being able to hear all sides of a case.
So that's a yes then.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
Sorry, I tried to raise my hand and I can't. It's Leah. Hi.
Yep.
And this is just informational purposes. So right now the CRB gets the entire investigative file, which includes the complaint. They don't hear about, sorry, I'm trying to explain. They don't hear from the people at the hearing, at the actual CRB meeting. That person's account of whatever has happened is included in the investigative report. So it's part of that whole file that they get. I just want to be clear that they are getting an investigation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I understand this, and I don't want to go take up much time and go off topic, but from all of what I've read, that when you have an investigation team that is internal to the police, that there are you don't always get the full story in those investigations. And one of the key recommendations is that there be an external body that is conducting these investigations.
Right.
Yeah. And so in absence of having an external body to conduct these investigations, this would serve as a check and balance on the potential limitations of that internal investigation.
Gotcha. Thank you. And thank you for letting me jump in there.
And, you know, this is why I wanted to have a motion pending in the ad hoc committee itself to have people who have gone through the system testify.
Yep. And we'll be going to that. That's going to be one of the first items on the agenda at the next meeting.
See people and what they've gone through, I think you'll better understand why this motion is so important.
Okay, we are still in the process of voting. Sorry. So can I just confirm? Brian is a yes. Daniel is a yes. Does anyone else have any discussion? Any further discussion? So Betsy.
Yes.
Rick.
Yes.
David.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes. I will, in terms of process, I think it's important to point out as well that we will attempt before this goes to the full committee to outline any broader legal hurdles that may exist. And Cindy, you can speak to this as to whether there are any legal issues to do with the protection of identity that you mentioned, or any other issues that would require this motion to either be modified in some way or to prevent it from being implemented under the current legal framework. But I think that the key thing to point out is that this is the will of the subcommittee to be brought to the full committee for broader discussion. It will then go into the report. And once it's in the report, we will be able to do a full legal assessment, and that will be amended as needed, or have notes added to it. So once it goes into the report and then goes to council, council will have a full idea of precisely what this recommendation would entail. That's the process we've discussed so far, and we will attempt to nail it down more as this process, as the ad hoc committee process proceeds. So we've spoken about hearing from complainants. The next item I have is regarding the CRB having subpoena power. And Cindy or Leah, I think we've had some discussions around this in other settings. So if you could clarify the extent to which subpoena power exists at the moment.
So because the CRB reviews closed investigations and they are not having their own hearing, they don't have subpoena power. As part of the internal investigation, officers are compelled to participate in those interviews. So, and then reporting parties, we have never, well, our office doesn't have subpoena power. I wouldn't say that we've ever felt limited by not having it. The only thing that we are missing typically would be medical records. But as far as, employees are required to participate under the terms of their contract. And then we get reporting parties who are the civilians or the complaining parties. So that's where we are now.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. Brian, would you like to move the motion and see if there's a second, and then we can move to discussion?
Sure. I guess I wrote these down in the reverse order. I'm debating which order you use, but all of this stems from the CRB being the investigative body, and which would change entirely how they are currently set up. And for that reason, I would move to give the CRB subpoena power, as mentioned in the motion, to assist in their ultimate investigation.
Okay, do we have any seconds?
I'm having a little trouble with this process, Kaz. So as I've read through these, a lot of the problems that I'm having relate to the limitations that are imposed on us by city charter in how these oversight bodies have been set up, and that within that structure, it seems that there's very little that we can do to truly strengthen the kind of oversight that seems to be recommended by various studies and bodies. And so to what extent can we recommend something that would require such fundamental changes to the structure of the city that might take either ordinance or city charter modifications to implement?
And anyone else can jump in if they feel they have more information. But my understanding is that the idea is to review policy. That's the charge that's given. And that this subcommittee can make any recommendation that relates to 21st century policing and Campaign Zero to go to the full committee. And then that in turn would go to the council. So the issue then is, like, you can recommend anything you like. There is a separate question, which is whether or not the city council would then choose to adopt or choose to adopt in part But fundamentally, and again, if there's anyone on the call who's able to clarify further, this is an advisory report, and the aim is to hear from communities that have been marginalized about what they believe would strengthen police oversight. So any recommendation that falls within the general purview of 21st century policing and Campaign Zero could be made. It may be that some of those are not viable, or that there are a great many other changes that may not take place. Or it would be very difficult to achieve in order to get those things to happen. But that's a separate issue, I believe, to the issue of making the recommendation. Is that?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Kaz, I think you've summed it up well. So this body has been charged with reviewing policy through the lens of 21st century policing and Campaign Zero, and making recommendations to the council for changes. And those recommendations will probably fall in a number of different areas. So we've talked about things that are kind of easily changed within the purview of what the council has control over. Some of the recommendations might fall into some sort of a state issue. So a recommendation could be, we would like our city council to write or lobby our state legislators on a particular issue. The recommendations might deal with a federal issue, and they might deal with a collective bargaining issue. But our charge is to make recommendations for Eugene police policy.
I mean, from my throw, I think that if the killer of Babs and the beating up of the woman and her son that were mentioned by myself and Lindsay yielded no discipline at all, then the system needs to be rebuilt. It's just not working. And so we can recommend the ways to rebuild that, which is what I tried to do, where these kinds of behaviors by police officers against citizens will result in discipline. Now, that the city is reluctant to do that is pretty obvious, but that's my input for what we recommend. I doubt it will be allowed by the city council, but that's why I think I want to put these recommendations in. Otherwise, we're just agreeing that, different words resulting in the same non-discipline result is better. And I'm trying to advocate that that's sincerely not better. That's why I'm making these recommendations and putting so much investigative power in the Civilian Review Board to institute discipline after a thorough investigation. Otherwise, we're just where we are now, maybe with better words. And that's my say.
So returning to the motion as proposed, and I understand concerns of members in this committee. We're working within the charge that was given to us by council. This is fundamentally an advisory body. And the advice that is given, there is a separate process as to the extent to which council chooses to adopt all or some of those recommendations, but your expertise and your experience will help to give us a clearer sense of what it is that the community really wants. So with that, is there a second for the motion that the CRB has subpoena power?
I'll second it, but there's still something fundamental underneath that subpoena power, which is that there is an external investigative body, and that external investigative body is the CRB, or is some other office that the CRB oversees. And that part not being a part of this motion, I don't really understand the context of the motion out of that context.
As Rick has his hand raised.
Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
I think that you put your finger on it in the last second part of your discussion, and that is that the investigation under the present system is left to the police auditor. The CRB reviews what the auditor has done to provide citizen input on whether or not the auditor has done his or her job. But the auditor is a separate entity from the police. So it's not the police investigating themselves. The auditor has available to it the internal affairs investigation that was done by the police and any other, and they participate in the interviews of the people involved. And the auditor makes a recommendation to the police chief for discipline or for a finding on whether there's been a policy violation. It's up to the police chief on discipline.
So
that's all a matter that's been bargained for under the collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. But my understanding is that internal affairs is conducting the investigation and the police auditor is auditing and overseeing that investigation to ensure that it was done properly. Am I wrong about that?
We also participate in it, but yes.
Okay.
They team up.
Which is very different from an independent office separate from the police department actually being the one to conduct the investigation outside of the police. And that's the piece of it that, from what I've read, is the important part of it. And then having a civilian review board that more directly oversees that investigation as a community oversight body.
Cindy, I saw your hand raised.
I did want to just add one additional component that is available to the auditor if they felt they needed to exercise it. If they, for any reason, feel like they're not getting the investigation that they want from the police department, they are authorized to conduct and hire an independent investigator separate from the police department. So that is already part of our process.
How many times has that been implemented, that you've brought in an independent investigator?
I can think of only one time prior to Mr. Gisner coming to as being our auditor that was initiated.
I know we've consulted with investigators a couple of times, but we have not ended up contracting with them. I will also add that the funding for external contracting is guaranteed in ordinance.
Okay, so returning then to the motion, Daniel, did you second? Just to confirm.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anyone who wishes to discuss?
Could you just repeat the motion now that we're going to be voting on?
The motion, as I understand it, is that the Civilian Review Board should have subpoena power as it investigates or reviews cases.
Thank you.
So again, Daniel, a second. I believe I have to confirm whether or not you are a yay.
Yay.
Yes. Betsy?
Yeah. Yeah.
David?
Yes.
And Rick?
No.
Okay, so 4-1, the motion passes. And with that, Brian, I believe you had one other, but unfortunately my notes are a little scrappy.
Well, there were actually two. One was the spoliation issue. And again, if this is assuming the CRB becomes the investigating body and not the police auditor. And I wrote in my little testimony my experience with him. So that kind of shocks my conscience, but maybe not yours. That's fine. But that's why I want the CRB to do it. And in that context, in order to conduct a thorough investigation, there's the issue of drug testing an officer after he or she is in a violent incident. And if you if their video cameras or audio recordings fail, the principle of spoliation would apply. And I wrote State v. Lance and how they applied it to two manslaughter counts and forcing the state to stipulate that the brakes were in fact functioning well. I mean, malfunctioning. Rick is probably the only one who's ever heard the term spoliation before. And that's why I kind of gave the quote from State v. Lance. So if the CRB is doing the investigation and they want to look at a video and the police do say, well, it broke or we lost it or malfunctioned, the police do not get to testify about what would have been on that video. And in my view, if it works for two manslaughter charges, it should certainly work for an excessive force accusation for the police. So those are the two other ones that I mentioned.
Okay, so to recap, that there should be mandatory drug testing of any officer that's involved in, do you mean a use of force incident or a use of force incident that results in a complaint?
A use of force incident, because, and the only reason is just timing. You know,
of course.
Yeah, and so you have to do it immediately. Drug tests, I mean, blood tests are the scientific method to know whether somebody's under the influence at the time. Urine tests are insufficient for that. So it would have to be immediately. And as soon as the case, you know, the incident is over. And then if a complaint is filed, that blood test would be given to the CRB for its investigation. If it is not filed, then I guess they would just dispose of it and be done with it. But, you know, I think police officers are so afraid of being drug testing that if we actually implement this rule into the code, you'll see a heck of a lot less violent episodes out on the street, a lot less.
Cindy, are you able to speak to the current protocols around this issue before we move to discussion? Cindy, you're muted.
There we go. Yeah, this is definitely not part of our protocol at this time. I'm wondering if there's an idea of a threshold level of the use of force, because we have a lot of reportable use of force now. So that would be something that we would be doing very regularly if it was just any reportable use of force. And there's a lot of other underlying issues, but if the CRB was an investigative body and had subpoena power, then they may have access to that, but that's medical information. So I could see all sorts of potential issues with that.
Okay. And could you clarify maybe something on the thresholds that exist currently in terms of what criteria there are for levels of use of force?
Sure. We currently have anything that is a reportable use of force could be as simple as a control hold. If it resulted in an injury, then it would be considered a reportable use of force, but it might not be. Brian had mentioned a violent use of force. So I was just curious if he had sort of a threshold in mind of what types of force would maybe generate that level of testing.
Okay, I see Rick, Betsy, and Daniel, and then we'll come back to you, Brian. So Rick.
Yeah, I would see some some problems with medical privilege involved in whether or not an officer had to do that under the minor situation that could be involved. I could see perhaps limiting it to deadly force situations. That might make sense to me. But I'm not sure an officer waives that much when he takes a job.
These are probably legal questions for attorneys.
I think Betsy was next in line and then Daniel.
My question was not relative to delineating the level of force. So I want, perhaps you should go on and come back to my question.
Okay, Daniel.
So I know that other public service jobs, I used to work for eWeb, and if there were, say, a member of a work crew who was operating heavy machinery or driving and there was an accident, they would be subject to a drug test immediately because of that. And that I don't understand why a police officer who is also a public servant whom we entrust with a great deal of responsibility and operating potentially deadly equipment, firearms, vehicles, etc., would not be subject to the same standard in the in that same kind of event. And yeah, I get all of the legal issues around it, but that this just seems to me to be something so basic that we need to know. Was that officer under the influence of anything at the time that deadly force was used?
So that's a slight departure from the wording of the motion, which is that any use of force should result in a blood test, I believe was Brian's precise phrase, which is different to a drug test. A blood test may be a drug test, but there are other forms of drug testing as well.
My understanding of what Brian was referring to was a blood test to check for
intoxicants.
Intoxicants or other things, possibly steroids could affect someone's judgment as well. But yeah, and as far as what the threshold of that use of force should be, I think that could be up for negotiation. At a minimum, deadly force, possibly severe injury, however you might define severe.
Okay, Betsy, if you'd like to, if you're on, if this is the same topic that you're on, please go ahead. Otherwise,
well, I have a question about this, what we're discussing, but it's not the threshold for use of force. I'm just unclear if there's a timeline associated with the drug test within a certain period. I didn't hear that. After the commission of the alleged use of force, did anyone?
I heard as immediately as possible afterwards.
So there was no specified time. So that could vary. Is that correct?
As the motion is currently worded, yes.
Okay.
Well, at the close of the event, when you beat somebody up, like my client woman and her son, you close the event. You don't take a blood test right there and then, but after she was arrested, put in jail, and all of that, and the case is closed, that's when it would occur.
How long does it take? I know you can't say this, but is there a way that you can give an estimate of how long it takes to close a case?
It's what we call a case-by-case basis. Depends how long the thing goes on. It's not predetermined.
I was just wondering how valid a drug test would be if it took a while to close the case.
Well, most drugs, I do a lot of Dewey cases, and, you know,
Right.
it stays in your blood for quite a while, which is why a blood test and a urine test, you know, you could have done the drugs yesterday, not while you were beating someone up or driving the car. So that's why I would suggest a blood test, both for the safety of the
Sure.
officer and so he's not wrongly accused. And so we get an immediate result of what was going on at the time when the assault happened. The objection I have to only deadly force is there's not a heck of a lot of deadly force. What there's a heck of a lot of is beatings. People get beaten up really badly, like my woman and her son. Now, if a complaint is not filed, then the blood test goes away. It's not revealed to anybody. But how do we test? You know, like I've always said, there were two officers there. One was extremely professional and one was extremely violent. And clearly the extremely professional officer was not on any drugs. But it would be good to know whether or not this other officer was on drugs and had a instinct or a need for violence because he acted that way. So how do we get to know whether that officer was on steroids or some other intoxicant which caused him to instigate calm situations into violent situations on no less than 2 or 3 occasions during that same event? This is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the legalities around it and the union opposition to it, that's all just part of the entire puzzle. But the question before us is, do we advocate for that or do we not? And I suggest that we do. And I also suggest that if this gets implemented, a lot of officers are going to stop being violent because they don't want to be drug tested. And it'll be a very effective tool.
So I think first, one other point of information that might be useful, Cindy, does EPD currently have a drug testing regimen? And if so, what does it consist of?
I don't have the policy in front of me right now, but generally speaking, as an employer, if we have reasonable suspicion that an officer is under intoxicants, then there's a process that the city does that we can require a drug test. But absent reasonable suspicion, that from an employment standpoint, that would, I think that'd be pretty tricky.
Okay, thank you for that. So once again, the motion as it is worded is that officers should
I'm sorry,
be...
Taz, but Rick had his hand up. And he
Oh,
wanted
my
to...
apologies.
Yep, thank you. I'm not certain that Mr. Michael's anecdotal evidence is a substantial reason to pass an ordinance or policy that would cost the city a lot of money and create a lot of issues to debate during the union contract time. He said there were a heck of a lot of incidents involving force, that he suspects that if there are drug tests after a use of force, that there would be less force. That there's really no evidence to establish that other than his anecdotal remarks. I hesitate to vote in favor of that on that basis at all.
Okay, I mean, we don't actually have a second as yet, as far as I recall. So yeah, the motion.
Sorry, may I ask one clarifying question, please?
Sure.
You said if there's reasonable suspicion, who makes that determination? If there's reasonable suspicion that an officer may have been on some substance, who would make that determination when you would do a drug test?
If it was reported to a supervisor or observed by a supervisor, typically they'd bring another supervisor in to get 2 supervisors to concur that reasonable suspicion threshold had been met, and then they could proceed with that process.
And that's based on the report of the incident?
based on either the supervisor's personal observation or another officer could come forward to a supervisor and report some concerns related to odor of alcohol in their breath or other visual indicators of perhaps that they are.
And do those internal reasonable suspicion sorts of events happen very often?
No, they do not.
Okay. Thank you. I'll second the motion.
The motion as it stands then is that officers should be drug tested after a use of force incident. Is that an accurate summation of your motion, Brian?
Yes, as soon as the event is closed. It's in the writing there somewhere.
Okay, and Betsy, you second the motion as it's just been articulated?
Yes, I'm assuming we can flesh out then that level of force, make it clearer.
You could also, I believe, propose a friendly amendment to say that certain kinds of use of force.
I hate to put you through
if
that.
Brian accepts.
Brian?
You'd have to propose. I mean, like, and it's not for me to.
I'd have to. Then.
Yeah.
Then no,
if you wish to amend to say, for example, deadly force, which is something that's been.
Yeah,
No.
I'd like to propose that a use of force that results in serious injury or death.
I'll accept that.
Okay. Then I will second that motion.
Okay, so to recap, officers should be drug tested at the close of the event in any use of force incident that results in serious injury or death.
And Kaz, I have a clarifying question.
Sure.
So, yeah, the question is, I think Brian's motion also had a second part to it. Maybe I misunderstood, but
I thought they were two separate items, Brian.
Okay.
There was one item on drug testing, and there was one item on, and you'll forgive me for how I mangle this, foliation. Is that the rough approximation?
Yeah, spoliation. It's a legalese word that means spoiled.
Okay.
But they wanted to sound fancy so we could charge lots of money, so they turned it into spoliation.
Oh, lawyer.
Okay, so yeah. Officers should be drug tested in the event of once a use of force incident is closed, if that use of force incident results in serious injury or death. And that is Brian proposing. And I believe it was Betsy seconding.
Yes.
So Betsy, do you vote yay or nay?
Yay.
David?
Yeah.
Rick?
Yes.
And Daniel?
I vote yay.
Okay, so moving on to the question of foliation.
Spoilage.
And what I have here is that in the event that there is no body camera footage available for an incident, that testimony that relates to that incident should not be permissible.
It's more if they somehow negligently, recklessly, or intentionally destroyed the recorder.
Right.
Yeah, if he doesn't have one, well, he can certainly testify about it because he hasn't destroyed or spoiled any evidence. But if they spoil their own evidence, then they're not allowed to testify about
it. Okay. So if a recording is recklessly or intentionally spoiled, then officer testimony on the events in question should not be admissible.
Yes, and it's negligently as well. And,
Yep.
and in fact, in the State v. Lance case, the destruction of the brake parts was negligent, neither reckless nor intentional.
Okay.
And yet they
So
still,
reckless, intentional, or negligent. All right. Should not be admissible.
I second that.
Okay, Daniel seconds. So, Brian, Daniel, do you vote yay or nay?
Yay.
David, yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Yep, thank you. Betsy?
We didn't get to have a lot of discussion over this. Just one question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Just quick question. Would this cover where an officer did not turn their video camera on?
I would think so, that if policy is that they turn their camera on and they neglect to turn their camera on, then that would be through neglect that the camera wasn't functioning.
Then I vote yay.
Sorry, I should have given more
No
opportunity
worries. No
for
worries. No worries.
discussion.
No worries.
Rick, and I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah. I'll lower it now.
I felt like we needed to talk a little bit about that first, which is that typically the complaint that Lindsay had was that sometimes almost in every case, I can't remember any case so far, their cameras have been turned on, but they have the availability to mute the audio if they're in a tactical discussion with their officers. I have never seen a case presented to the Citizens Review Board that where the discussion that has been muted has been during or before any conduct that has been complained of. It's always been after the fact. And so it may, the extent to which it would be valuable might be for any admission that the officer might make about what conduct he or she committed at the time. And that would seem to be a relevant fact, but I'm not certain it rises to the level required by the rule of evidence of spoliation. And spoliation really is a rule of evidence in a criminal trial. And it can be used in a civil case also if the evidence has been intentionally disposed of and it's not available for testing by the other side. But we're not in a criminal case here. We're in the investigation of an officer during an administrative hearing regarding his or her occupation. What effect, barring the officer from testifying, raises issues that I'm not prepared to discuss right now. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be, should be left to the bargaining at the table between the officers union and the city. So I see it as a situation where it's not going to affect the policy that the police policies. It's not something that the city council can do in ordinance. It's not something the state can do in statute, and it's not something the federal government can do in a statute. So that, for that reason, I'm going to vote no.
Okay. So that is 4-1. The motion passes. I think it is worth reiterating, Rick, that whilst it's very important to go through the the various blockages or routes that cannot be taken, that the main purpose of this committee is to make recommendations. And obviously, when we go through the stage of taking the recommendations that come forward and writing them into the report, part of our work will be precisely what you said just here. So thank you for bringing the issue up. But I would not want there to not be discussion of these items. Of course, informed discussion, and we, in this case, you've helped us to understand that this is probably be a collective bargaining issue. But I think it bears repeating because of the curious position we find ourselves in with this committee, that the main aim is to recommend, and then once the recommendations have been made, then there are other questions to do with who is responsible and what the viability would be. But yes, thank you for bringing that issue up. Brian, I believe we've covered everything that was on the agenda as you put it forward. And Betsy, from what I recall, you had the issue of business cards and one other.
Well, the business card was a little different context, and we can get into that when we discuss it, but yes, that is the area. The other one I had was the independent investigation. If we've got something about the Civilian Review Board being an independent investigator, don't we already have that on the recommendations?
I mean, to be honest, the way that things have gone is that Brian has talked about a lot of the details that would be necessary were that the case. But I don't believe anyone's actually put forward that the Civilian Review Board should have the power of an independent investigator. Before we proceed down that road, Leah,
Okay.
I would like to ask you what, if any, implications you can think of that there might be for proposing, if the motion were put forward, what it might look like in practice as different from what it is now.
No pressure.
Leah, can I interject, Leah, perhaps
Sure.
an explanation as to what happens when either the auditor or the Citizen Review Board views the case as a community impact case in which the Civilian Review Board does obtain some investigative power in that situation. Perhaps a distinction could be to explain to everybody.
Sure, thanks, Rick. So typically, as Rick was sort of inferring, the CRB reviews closed cases, and then they say whether or not they agreed with the adjudication. To be clear, the chief has final adjudication power. Our office makes recommended adjudications, but the chief gets to decide fully. Also, sorry, I'm just giving an overview of the whole process, which I know I already did at the full meeting, but we also don't have input into discipline. So our part of involvement is done at adjudication. When there is a community impact case, the chief makes sort of a preliminary adjudication that again is based on recommendations from our office and from the chain of command. And then the CRB reviews that case within 14 days. They can say if they don't think the investigation was complete, they can direct the chief to undertake additional investigation. They can say that they don't agree with the adjudication. If they say that, the chief has to answer for what they do next. So there are basically three options that the CRB can do in a community impact case before that case is closed, before discipline is administered. I can pop that in the chat if people are interested. Kaz, to the more general question of what it would look like if CRB was an investigative board, that's really difficult to say. There's a whole lot of models out there. There's a lot of different ways that communities have instituted civilian oversight. One way is to have a civilian review board that is an investigative group.
Sorry to cut across you. Am I correct in understanding that the ballot measure that was passed in Portland recently is pretty much that model?
Yeah, so I'm going to confess to a very small, I read about that but I'm not sure exactly how it's going to look. But yes, it is a different model than ours. So ours is basically our office reports to the legislative branch of the government. We are not part of the executive branch of city government. And that's one reason why we stay out of discipline, because discipline is administered by the executive branch of city government. The CRB then oversees us and advises also the legislative branch of the city government. But were the CRB to become a disciplinary board or sort of more, I'm going to say more involved, that's not really the word I'm looking for, but an investigative board, there would be, I guess there's just a lot of considerations about who they would report to, who they would make recommendations to, how they have staff, etc.
So with that in mind, Betsy, are you still interested in putting forward a motion on that subject?
You know, it's something to consider. So yeah, I would be willing to put forth the motion that we at least recommend and explore the Civilian Review Board being an independent investigative entity. Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, there are many reasons I understand why that may not happen, but if we don't entertain it, we don't discuss it. If we don't discuss it, we don't get anything. So
I second that.
yeah.
So I think that, look, we're in a situation where people have less and less trust and faith in the law enforcement. And in order for that to be altered, community has to be more engaged, and that oversight. I mean, one of the pieces, I can't remember if it's 21st Century or Campaign Zero, but it says some form of civilian oversight of law enforcement is important in order to strengthen trust with community. Every community should define the appropriate form and structure of civilian oversight to meet the needs of that community. So I feel like this policy piece really skirts the fact that we need to ask, like, is what we have what we want? And that is the question that probably nobody wants to have to tackle, but I think that's a good recommendation. Now, whether people have the courage to move forward with something like that, that's a different thing.
Let me jump in here just for a second, and I'm not sure that we have a clear motion yet.
Would you like me to read it off the Excel file relative to one of the criteria to make it clear?
I think that would be helpful, and then there can be a second.
Betsy, I might have something.
Oh, well, please go ahead.
Yeah, I also have something, but I can maybe offer it as a friendly amendment after your something.
All right, I just wrote it up. So recommend the city conduct, I don't know, like an external review or analysis of our community's oversight structure so we can engage community in determining an appropriate form and structure that meets the needs of our community so we can achieve a community-driven system. I don't know if that, I don't know. But Daniel, if you have better language, go for it.
Yeah, for the sake of using the CRB just as the name of it, whatever it is, that the CRB should adjudicate cases involving excessive use of force, abuse of authority, unlawful arrest, unlawful stop, unlawful searches, discourtesy or disrespectful behavior, use of offensive language, theft, and discriminatory behavior. That the CRB has authority to conduct independent investigations, including the authority to subpoena witnesses and documents, including internal police disciplinary documents, medical records, surveillance footage, and other materials relevant to an investigation. Once the CRB's staff completes its thorough investigation and the board substantiates an allegation of misconduct, the board's findings of fact will be binding on the head of the police department, who will then determine discipline based on those facts and guided by a pre-negotiated disciplinary matrix.
Wow, that was a lot more specific than
I can put that in the chat.
I would certainly appreciate that because I'm not going to be able to note all of that down.
Is this also being that specific? Does that also, because that may just get shot down instantaneously, as has been our experience.
Possibly,
but
yeah.
you know, does it leave open if it's that specific? Does it leave bargaining room? You know, where we might could come up with some independent.
I would say all of this is open to negotiation.
Okay.
The whole point about the pre-negotiated disciplinary matrix is that then the CRB is not making any recommendation of discipline. That's left up to the police chief, but the police chief, bound by those facts, says if it's a case that has these facts, then you go to the matrix, and that discipline must be within the range of that defined matrix.
Fair enough.
That's the idea behind that.
So David, does that mean with what you were saying when you?
I mean, you're jumping right to it. So if that's what you guys want, yeah.
There's one small but important difference between the two motions, which is, David, I believe that what you were suggesting was a sort of feasibility study, whereas Daniel is just saying set up the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about not. No, there's no feasibility study. It needs, like, we need to know what works for people, especially those people who don't feel like justice is being served for them, and they don't feel safe and able to get the help that they need. So that's feasible. Like, we can do that now. It is different in that way. Like Daniel's basically says, let's do this thing specifically. So
right.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm open to it being marked up and amended. But that's the basic idea of it.
I guess what I'm afraid of is that, like, this process that we're going through is we're like trying to fix something, little pieces, and really, like, it's, it's kind of frustrating, and it's very, it's limiting, and not going to get us, I think, to where we need to be. And so that's why I brought forward that specific language, but I'm open.
I would say that the Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing, as you cited yourself, do allow for precisely the kind of motion that both you and Daniel have put forward. So we can absolutely look at the nitty-gritty detail, but the policy framework also allows for looking at the high-level stuff.
Yeah, that's why I brought, yeah.
Brian?
It was my second bullet point and what was distributed from what I wrote. But the only difference I would make to point out here is, if the ultimate decision to discipline is left with the police, even the chief of police, there will be no discipline. This is the history we have. And if history is any predictor of future behavior, that's what's going to happen. The idea I have for the Civilian Review Board is that civilians get to make that disciplinary decision. And if it gets appealed to the city council. Yeah, otherwise, we're just going to be in the same place we have been for years with no discipline. So I've moved to amend that so that the Civilian Review Board decides whether or not there is discipline. And if the police want to appeal that decision, they can do so to the city council.
I didn't see that as inconsistent with what was said, because there's a discipline matrix. And so doesn't the Civilian Review Board go to the matrix to determine it, and then that's sort of the discipline that gets enacted?
Well, the police chief is the one who enacts the disciplinary action, which is his role and responsibility, but he is bound by the facts to discipline according to that pre-negotiated matrix. He can't just say, well, he didn't really mean any harm, so I won't discipline him at all. That would be outside the matrix.
So I believe that that counts as not accepting that as a friendly amendment, or
No, I don't see that it's necessary.
okay.
So does that mean that there's no disciplinary role for that board? Is that what you're saying?
No, that the role of that board is to conduct the investigation and to make a determination of the facts of that case, to which the chief of police is then bound to implement discipline according to those facts.
And the board's findings are going to be considered, they have to go through this matrix that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's essentially a way of getting around what was talked about that separation of the administrative versus the legislative duties and authorities of the body.
Okay.
I see Rick.
I think Daniel has created an interesting approach. And what it does is puts the onus on some other body to negotiate the matrix. That would have to be done outside of the process of an individual case. The matrix would already be in existence at the time that the finding of fact takes place. And so that the chief would then be bound by that, but the chief should have input, and others in the public and the city council should have input as to what is in the matrix and how the matrix is designed. And I think that makes some sense systematically. So that tends to turn me toward a vote in favor of it. So long as there's an adequate basis for the conclusion as to the matrix ahead of time. It brings up the issue that's always there in connection with sentencing and that type of thing, in that it takes the discretion away from the judge, or in this case, the chief of police, and makes it a strict, limited boundary for that a certain set of facts would formulate the conclusion. And so long as the matrix is well designed, it's certainly a viable way to approach it.
Does anyone have any further discussion on this one?
On the specific one. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Betsy, didn't mean
No
to step
worries,
on you
no
there.
worries, Kevin, go.
Who seconded the motion?
I was just about to ask who asked that, because we've been in the process of discussing it as a paragraph in that's been read out. So I was asking if there's anyone else had anything to say, and then I was going to invite Daniel to propose it.
Daniel, would I did have one thing. Would the board, they can't say anything like, well, in this case, we would grant the chief, the flexibility to be able to, I don't know, that freedom. You got to follow that process. You got to follow the matrix, and that's it. It's set in stone. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and the matrix could be a range, so there could be some discretion in there of, whether for a violation of that policy and the facts, that maybe it's a range of 1 week suspension without pay and 3 week suspension without pay, and within that range, but the chief of police has some discretion. But it must follow that, whatever that's predefined. And I didn't really read much on how you get to and how you negotiate that disciplinary matrix. That's a whole other thing. And I imagine it would involve the police chief and the union and other groups.
Many other groups, I'm sure.
Many, yeah.
So would you like to propose that as a motion, Daniel?
Do you want me to read it again, or I put it in the chat?
I'm happy to read it out if that would make life
Okay,
easier.
yeah, there
And I
we-
made the minor amendment that you
Okay.
suggested in chat,
Okay,
which
thank
was
you.
removing some parentheses. So what I have here is CRB should adjudicate cases involving excessive use of force, abuse of authority, unlawful arrest, unlawful stop, unlawful searches, discourtesy or disrespectful behavior, use of offensive language, theft and discriminatory behavior. CRB has the authority to conduct independent investigations, and at the heart of such authority must be the abilities to subpoena witnesses and documents, including internal police disciplinary documents, medical records, surveillance footage, and other materials relevant to an investigation. Once the CRB's professional staff completes its thorough investigation and the board substantiates an allegation of misconduct, the board's findings of fact will be binding on the head of the police department, who will then determine discipline based on those facts and guided by a pre-negotiated disciplinary matrix.
Thank you, Kaz. Well done.
No worries.
Second.
Was that Brian?
Richard.
It
With
was
the
Rick.
second.
It was Rick who
Richard.
Okay. Rick with the second.
beat me to it.
Okay. So Rick, do you is that a yay or a nay for you?
That's a yay.
David?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
Betsy?
Yes.
And I believe that's everyone. I don't think I've left anyone out there. That passes 5-0. I would just like to make committee members aware of the time. We're about 10 minutes away from our allotted time of 2 hours.
Can we honor David's idea of the more global feasibility and put something forth in that regard as a motion?
With specific regards to the motion that was just passed, or a general?
A separate one, the motion for the global, what was it, Dave? How did you say it?
I couldn't understand what she said. Could you?
David had put forth a higher level, and I thought you had said that Campaign Zero and 21st Commission had both this threading the needle, the specific, but it also had the higher level.
Yeah. Just recommending that the council, conduct a review of our community oversight structure in a way that engages community and determines, what if it's going to, if this is working, and if not, then what do people want to see that's different, not just because we don't know what community necessarily wants. We're not there. So what does public safety look like? So
Sorry. I just wanted to clarify how that would differ from the process that we're currently undertaking, how its charge and scope would be different.
It would actually be about creating, I guess it would be basically creating a vision for public safety that's community driven and engaged by community, because we don't know. I don't know. I don't feel like there's a sense of consensus on what, and I mean, I know we can't get everybody on the same board, but I don't get the sense that there's an idea of what public safety is here in the community. So it differs in wherever you live and what your experience is, and that's so it would be different because we're not looking at necessarily just policies, but actually, structure and does it work for us?
Right.
Do we have data on, geographic beats or whatever, like that's you know, disaggregated, and so we can evaluate if people of color are being really served, and if not, how do we do that? So more of a structural, overarching view.
Okay, so from what you've said, would the council should look at community safety structures to ensure that they are
appropriate for the community. That's what the language in that chart.
I think we may have lost Kaz.
Oh, he froze up on that one.
Oh, he did.
You broke him, David.
We broke him. I'm so sorry, Kaz.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to text him and let him know. Okay, he's going to.
I don't know. Is it like a TAC report for public safety? Like, you know, a TAC report and 5-year plan and like that. I think it's blown up to the point where it needs, you know, it needs that level of examination. So I know it's good to reform things, and we got to kind of fix things as we go along, but it's not where we want it to be just yet. So
I think I know what you're saying. Is there some way that this greater sort of thing could be, because yes, we make these specific changes, but that doesn't mean the community sees the change. It doesn't mean that they see it as good or that it has any positive impact on their lives. So at that point, do we have to go back to the drawing board and have some mechanism for that, where the community says, okay, you took your best shot as this commission driven by existing policies and existing reports, but it's not doing anything for us. Can we have a way to do what David is saying and say, okay, help us to do better and define these things? Is that possible?
It's certainly a recommendation that this committee could choose to make. But I would need a precise form of words from somebody.
David, it's your turn.
I guess I'm going to try to use the language that's in this matrix that you sent us. I guess I would recommend that the city council engage community in, let's see, in defining and evaluating existing form and structure of civilian oversight and defining the appropriate one for this community.
So these specific things that we are recommending or proposing and voting on, that could be seen as the current form, so that this could then be sort of above that.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Looks like we've lost Kaz again.
We broke him.
So I will step in and try to shepherd the process here. So what we're trying to do in the next few minutes is to come up with a clear wording. Kaz, there you are.
I'm going to suggest that you take over for this because my internet's clearly not conducive to getting anything done.
Okay, glad to do it. A little pinch hit here. So what we're trying to do is come up with a precise wording of the motion, which I think, David, you just did. So we're at the point now of a second. We'll go into a discussion and then a vote. And then folks we're going to be out of time for tonight. So
I second.
was that Daniel?
Yes.
All right, now we have time for discussion. The motion on the table is from David about evaluating our existing civilian oversight structure. Discussion?
I think that's a part of what we're doing here, but there's a big piece of it which is engaging the community at large around specifically community oversight that might not bring everything to light in this forum and in the context of the ad hoc committee.
Thank you. Other discussion? Hearing none. We can vote. Daniel?
Aye.
Betsy?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Kaz, I'm going to toss it back to you to wind this thing down.
Okay. And if I drop out, I A, apologize, and B, Kevin, if you could take this thing home.
Sure.
So we are reaching time. I want to thank everybody who's participated. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been excellent to have some really substantive discussion, which has been rather trickier to achieve in the larger meetings. So I'd like to thank you all once again, and to remind you, over the next couple of days, we will pull this stuff together, send it out to the wider committee. And I would like to ask for somebody to move to adjourn the meeting.
I move we adjourn the meeting.
And that requires a second. And I also learned that it's not required to have a roll call once the second is received.
Second.
Okay, thank you very much. And for the staff who've given their time as well. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for your participation.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
All you guys who work for the city overtime, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.